There's a specific move almost every narcissist makes when he wants to reconcile, one so consistent across different people and different relationships that once you've seen it clearly, you'll recognize it instantly every time it appears again, whether from him specifically or from anyone else who shares this particular psychological pattern. Today, we're going to trace exactly what this move is, why it works so consistently as his default approach to reconciliation, and why understanding it protects you regardless of how many times he attempts it or how convincing each individual attempt happens to feel. The move. He skips accountability entirely and goes straight to future-focused promises. This is the pattern worth understanding in careful detail because its consistency reveals something important about the underlying psychological mechanism producing it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about why genuine accountability proves so structurally difficult for narcissistic psychology, the way acknowledging specific harm threatens a self-concept that cannot survive full confrontation with wrongdoing. This structural limitation explains why reconciliation attempts almost universally bypass the specific, uncomfortable work of naming exactly what happened, exactly how it hurt you, exactly what he actually did wrong, in favor of something considerably more comfortable for his psychology to produce. Vague, future-oriented commitment that requires no genuine reckoning with the past at all. Here's what this actually sounds like in practice, because recognizing the specific verbal pattern matters enormously for identifying it accurately in real time. I want us to start fresh. I know things haven't been perfect, but I really think we can build something better going forward. Let's just focus on moving forward instead of dwelling on the past. Notice what's conspicuously absent from every one of these statements. Any specific reference to what actually happened, any accounting of specific harm caused, any acknowledgement that would require him to sit, even briefly, with the discomfort of naming his own wrongdoing directly, rather than gesturing vaguely toward an unspecified, unexamined past that supposedly no longer requires discussion now that the future has become the focus instead. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the technique that actually produces the words, "I'm sorry," the crucial distinction between narrow, factual apology for specific incidents and comprehensive accountability for broader patterns. This future-focused move represents something considerably more evasive than even the narrow apology we discussed previously. It doesn't require acknowledging even one specific incident. It simply skips the entire accountability phase altogether, substituting forward momentum for backward examination, hoping the promise of improvement will feel sufficiently reassuring that you won't notice the complete absence of any genuine reckoning with what actually needs to change and why. Here's why this move works so consistently as his default reconciliation strategy, beyond simply being easier for his psychology to produce than genuine accountability. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about hope functioning as one of the primary mechanisms keeping empaths invested in these relationships far longer than the evidence would otherwise justify. Future-focused promises specifically powerfully activate exactly this hope because they offer something genuinely appealing, the possibility of a different, better version of the relationship, without requiring you to first sit through the uncomfortable, sometimes painful work of fully examining what actually went wrong. This is precisely why the move proves so effective, at least initially. It bypasses the discomfort of accountability for both of you simultaneously, offering forward momentum that feels considerably more pleasant than backward-looking confrontation, even though this pleasant feeling comes at the direct cost of ever actually addressing the underlying pattern that produced the harm in the first place. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this move specifically targets hope rather than any other emotional lever. Remember what we discussed extensively about the exhausted patience that develops over years of narcissistic relationships, the specific quality of hope that's been repeatedly disappointed but not yet fully extinguished. Future-focused promises speak directly to this remaining hope, offering exactly what it's been waiting for. Evidence that things might genuinely be different this time, without requiring the harder, more uncomfortable evidence, genuine, specific accountability for what actually happened that would actually indicate whether this hope has any legitimate foundation or whether it's simply being activated again through the same familiar mechanism that's failed to produce lasting change every previous time it's been triggered. If someone sincerely wants to repair a relationship, there is one question they cannot avoid. What exactly did I do that caused you to lose trust? That question sounds simple. Psychologically, it's one of the most revealing moments in any reconciliation. Why? Because it forces a person to shift their attention away from defending themselves and toward understanding someone else's experience. Healthy accountability naturally moves in that direction. Manipulation usually moves somewhere else. Instead of becoming curious about your pain, the conversation often becomes focused on your reaction. Rather than asking why you stopped trusting them, they begin asking why you're still holding on to the past. Notice how subtle that shift is. The original issue quietly disappears. The new issue becomes your inability to move on. When that happens, the relationship hasn't actually begun healing. The focus has simply been redirected. This explains why so many people leave these conversations feeling strangely confused. On the surface, nothing openly hostile was said. There were kind words, warm memories, optimistic promises, and yet something still feels unfinished. That feeling deserves attention, because trust rarely disappears through one dramatic event. More often, it erodes through repeated experiences where reality and words stop matching. Real repair reverses that process. It doesn't begin with promises. It begins with consistency. Imagine someone accidentally breaking an expensive family heirloom. A sincere apology matters, but if they continue handling everything carelessly afterward, the apology gradually loses its meaning. Behavior either strengthens words or quietly replaces them. Relationships work exactly the same way. One honest conversation cannot repair years of repeated emotional inconsistency. Trust returns through repeated evidence, not repeated reassurance. That's why genuinely changed people are usually surprisingly patient. They understand that rebuilding confidence takes time. They don't become offended because someone remains cautious. In fact, they expect caution. After all, they know their own actions created it. Someone who has genuinely reflected on the damage doesn't demand immediate forgiveness. They recognize that forgiveness and trust are related, but they are not identical. You may forgive someone long before trusting them again. That distinction often frustrates people who want quick reconciliation, because trust cannot be negotiated. It can only be demonstrated. Another pattern frequently appears during attempts to reconnect. The narcissist often speaks passionately about feelings. I've missed you. I think about you all the time. I've never stopped loving you. Those statements may even feel sincere in the moment, but feelings alone don't predict future behavior. Every healthy long-term relationship eventually depends on something more stable than emotion: character. Character determines what someone does when emotions change, when they're disappointed, when they're criticized, when they're frustrated. Anyone can sound loving during a calm conversation. The real question is how they behave when life becomes uncomfortable again. That's where patterns reveal themselves. This is also why many survivors become cautious about dramatic declarations. Earlier in life, powerful emotion felt convincing. Now they quietly ask a different question. What happens after this conversation ends? Will boundaries still be respected next week? Will honesty remain when disagreement appears? Will actions remain consistent after the excitement of reconciliation fades? Those questions protect something extremely valuable: reality, because reality always unfolds over time. There is another important difference between genuine change and strategic reconciliation. A genuinely changed person becomes interested in understanding themselves. A manipulative person usually remains interested in understanding what will work on you. That distinction is easy to overlook. One conversation focuses inward, the other focuses outward. One asks, "Why did I keep repeating those behaviors?" The other silently asks, "How do I get this relationship back?" Those are completely different motivations, and different motivations eventually produce different outcomes. Perhaps the clearest evidence appears when you say no. Healthy people may feel disappointed, but they respect the boundary. Someone primarily motivated by regaining control often experiences the boundary itself as the problem. Suddenly, the warmth begins fading. Frustration appears. Guilt enters the conversation. Pressure quietly increases. That's because the reconciliation was never only about connection, it was also about restoring influence. The moment influence becomes impossible, the emotional tone frequently changes. This is why boundaries are such powerful sources of information. They reveal what words alone never can. Anyone can promise change. Not everyone can consistently respect limits they don't like. Which brings us to one final observation. The move people make when they truly want to rebuild trust isn't dramatic. It isn't filled with grand speeches or emotional promises. It's surprisingly ordinary. They tell the truth. They answer difficult questions. They accept responsibility without immediately asking for forgiveness. They allow time to do what words cannot. Because they understand something that manipulation never fully accepts. Real reconciliation isn't created by convincing someone to believe you again. It's created by becoming someone whose behavior quietly earns belief back, one consistent action at a time. The final question isn't whether the narcissist says the right things. The final question is much quieter. What happens after you stop making the conversation easy? This is where genuine change and manipulation almost always begin separating from one another. Imagine that you don't immediately accept the apology. You don't argue. You don't accuse. You simply remain careful. You ask for time. You maintain the same boundaries that helped you regain your emotional stability. A healthy person may find that disappointing, but they understand it. After all, trust is something they hope to earn, not something they believe they're entitled to receive. Someone who is primarily interested in restoring control often responds very differently. Patience begins disappearing. The conversation becomes subtly urgent. You may hear statements like, "I thought we were past this." "How long are you going to punish me?" "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Notice the shift. Only moments earlier, the focus seemed to be your healing. Now the focus has quietly become your response. Instead of asking what you need to feel emotionally safe, they're asking why you haven't returned to the relationship quickly enough. That change tells you something important. The goal was reconciliation only, as long as reconciliation happened on their timeline. Healthy repair respects another person's pace. Manipulation tries to control it. This is why boundaries become such powerful teachers. Boundaries don't exist to change another person. They exist to reveal them. A respectful person sees a boundary and adjusts their behavior. A controlling person often sees a boundary as something to negotiate, challenge, or slowly wear down. You don't need endless conversations to discover which one you're facing. Time reveals it naturally. Another important change happens inside the healed empath during this stage. Earlier in life, silence often felt unbearable. If someone became distant, she rushed to repair the connection. If conflict appeared, she felt responsible for resolving it. Now she understands something entirely different. Not every silence needs to be filled. Not every relationship needs to be saved. Not every goodbye is a mistake. That realization creates an emotional freedom that manipulation struggles to influence. Because urgency loses its power over someone who is no longer afraid of walking away. There is another mistake many people make during reconciliation. They assume that strong emotion proves sincere transformation. It doesn't. Emotion tells you how someone feels today. Character tells you how they behave tomorrow. Those are very different measurements. Anyone can promise consistency. Consistency itself can only be demonstrated over weeks, months, sometimes years. This is why emotionally healthy people become surprisingly interested in patterns instead of isolated moments. One beautiful conversation matters. 20 consistent conversations matter more. One thoughtful apology matters. Months of respectful behavior matter far more. One promise creates hope. Repeated actions create trust. And trust has always been built far more slowly than hope. Perhaps the greatest sign of healing is this: you no longer feel pressured to make a decision during the conversation itself. You understand that you don't owe anyone an immediate answer simply because they're emotionally persuasive. You can listen, you can observe, you can thank someone for their words, and you can still choose to wait before deciding whether those words represent genuine change. Waiting isn't cruelty, it's wisdom. Time has a remarkable way of exposing what emotion tries to hide. Eventually, every relationship becomes a pattern. The question is whether that pattern moves toward greater honesty or returns to familiar cycles. If today's conversation leaves you with one lasting thought, let it be this: when someone wants to make up after causing deep emotional harm, don't focus first on what they promise. Watch what they're willing to face. Do they acknowledge specific actions without shifting blame? Do they respect boundaries they didn't choose? Do they remain consistent after the emotional conversation has ended? Do they accept that rebuilding trust may take far longer than losing it did? Those questions will tell you far more than any beautifully delivered apology ever could. Because real reconciliation isn't measured by how convincing someone sounds in a single moment. It's measured by whether their daily behavior gradually creates a reality where trust no longer has to be requested. It simply begins to grow again. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. The healthiest decision isn't choosing between hope and cynicism. It's choosing observation over assumption. Let people show you who they are, not only when they're trying to win you back, but when they realize that genuine change requires effort long after the conversation is over. That's where the truth always lives. Not in the promise, but in the pattern. There is another stage of reconciliation that deserves careful attention because it rarely happens during the first conversation. It unfolds over the weeks that follow, after the emotions have settled and ordinary life begins again. This is the stage where consistency quietly replaces conversation. During the initial reunion, almost anyone can appear patient. Almost anyone can sound reflective. Almost anyone can express regret while emotions are high. The real test begins when the relationship is no longer new again. Routine has a way of revealing what excitement temporarily conceals. Notice what happens when everyday frustrations return. A disagreement over something small, a misunderstanding, a delayed response to a message, a boundary that wasn't part of the original conversation. These ordinary moments become surprisingly important because they reveal whether change has become part of someone's character or whether it only existed during the emotional high of reconciliation. Healthy growth usually becomes more visible during ordinary moments than extraordinary ones. A person who has genuinely reflected on their behavior doesn't only communicate differently when discussing the relationship, they communicate differently during stress. They become less defensive, more curious, more willing to pause before reacting. more capable of asking questions instead of making assumptions. Those changes are difficult to fake consistently because they require internal work rather than external performance. Performance becomes exhausting. Character becomes natural. That distinction explains why time remains one of the greatest allies of discernment. The longer you observe someone, the harder it becomes for appearance alone to sustain itself. Patterns naturally emerge. Another important sign appears in how someone responds when they don't receive immediate reassurance. Earlier in the relationship, reassurance may have become the solution to almost every conflict. Whenever tension appeared, they expected you to quickly restore emotional comfort. After reconciliation, healthy growth looks different. A mature person gradually develops the ability to regulate disappointment without demanding that someone else remove it immediately. They don't require constant proof that everything is okay. They allow trust to rebuild at a realistic pace. This matters because emotional security cannot grow where one person constantly feels responsible for managing another person's emotional stability. Relationships flourish when both individuals carry responsibility for their own emotional regulation. That balance creates safety. Without it, even sincere attempts at rebuilding eventually become exhausting. There is another subtle difference that often goes unnoticed. People who have genuinely changed become surprisingly comfortable saying, "I don't know. I don't know why I reacted that way. I don't know everything I still need to learn. I don't know how long rebuilding trust will take." Those statements may seem ordinary, but psychologically they reveal humility. Humility allows learning. Certainty often prevents it. Someone who believes they already understand everything rarely becomes curious enough to keep growing. Real change requires exactly that curiosity. It requires accepting that growth is an ongoing process rather than a finished achievement. Another useful question to ask yourself is this: how do I feel after spending time with this person now? Not during the conversation itself, after it. Do you leave feeling calmer or more confused? Do you feel respected or subtly guilty? Do you feel free to think for yourself or pressured to make decisions before you're ready? Our emotional experience often notices patterns before our logical mind fully organizes them. That doesn't mean every uncomfortable feeling is evidence of manipulation, but recurring confusion deserves thoughtful attention. Healthy relationships tend to increase clarity over time. Unhealthy dynamics often increase uncertainty. As weeks pass, clarity should become easier, not harder to find. There is also the question of responsibility. Healthy reconciliation never asks one person to carry the entire emotional weight of rebuilding the relationship. Both people contribute, both people reflect, both people adjust. When only one person is consistently making sacrifices, changing routines, overlooking disappointments, or managing conflict, balance quietly disappears. Without balance, trust gradually weakens again. One of the most encouraging signs of genuine maturity is the willingness to accept natural consequences. Someone who has truly changed understands that forgiveness cannot erase history overnight. They recognize that rebuilding confidence may take months. They don't become resentful because healing has its own timeline. Instead, they respect the process. That respect often communicates more than words ever could. Perhaps the greatest lesson reconciliation can teach has very little to do with the other person. It teaches you about yourself. You begin noticing how differently you make decisions. Instead of reacting immediately, you become comfortable observing. Instead of explaining every boundary, you simply maintain it. Instead of searching for certainty after one conversation, you allow repeated experiences to provide the answer naturally. This slower way of evaluating relationships isn't fear. It's wisdom earned through experience. It doesn't prevent love, it protects it, because healthy love doesn't require abandoning discernment. In fact, the strongest relationships are often built by people who know how to combine compassion with clear boundaries. They remain open hearted without becoming unprotected. They remain forgiving without becoming naive. They remain hopeful without ignoring evidence. That balance is one of the clearest signs of emotional growth. And ultimately, that's what real reconciliation depends on. Not dramatic promises, not emotional speeches, not perfectly chosen words, but two people consistently choosing honesty over image, accountability over excuses, patience over pressure, and respect over control. When those qualities remain present long after the apology has faded into memory, trust has a chance to grow again. When they disappear as soon as life becomes inconvenient, the answer becomes clear on its own. You no longer have to guess. You simply observe. And observation, over time, has a remarkable way of revealing the truth.